In gregarious and highly mobile birds such as manakins, getting left behind is nearly the worst of all possible fates. So when one flies, the others don't wait round to argue or complain. It sometimes happens that a good deal of apparently aimless flying about takes place before a startled or restless flock finally settles again, more by a sort of group inertia than any form of leadership. Ornithologists believe that the manakins are rather recent self-introduced invaders from overseas. If so, the Pictorella manakin is probably an even earlier colonizer from the same stock. Its stronghold is the interior northwest, and it seems to have been in Australia long enough to evolve many characteristics more suited to a desert environment than to its original grassland home. For example, it's a little more reluctant to associate with other manakins. It tends to be nomadic, scattering in small groups during the wet, though it often gathers in large flocks near the coast in times of drought. It also spends much more time on the ground, eats more ripe rather than unripe seeds, and consumes far more insects than other manakins. One of the more subtle hints of its non-desert heritage is that it does not drink by sucking as many other desert grassfinches do, but uses the scoop, tilt and swallow method common to most birds. Coastal heaths in southern Australia have this in common with rainforests. Grasses are rare, and both habitats are therefore challenging environments for grassfinches. But these damp southeastern moors are home to the beautiful firetail, which is most common where streams choked with shrubbery meander across low, dense heaths. It is confined to southeastern Australia from about Newcastle to Adelaide, and is the only one of the grassfinches that occurs in Tasmania. Its solitary habits contrast markedly with other grassfinches. Usually encountered in pairs during the breeding season, it only occasionally forms small parties at other times. Though the birds will eat any insects, tiny snails, or other small life they might encounter, the bulk of their diet consists of seeds, in search of which they clamber nimbly about in the dense vegetation like miniature parrots. Seeds are either nibbled individually from the stem or stripped off en masse. the birds feed on the ground in open areas, gathering seeds and minute insects. They also sometimes gather grit to aid in digestion, though this is less important to grassfinches than it is to some other seed-eating birds, such as pigeons, that lack powerful bills with which to crush their food before swallowing. Like other small songbirds, beautiful firetails wait for the most secluded and quietest times, when they feel safest before bathing. Even then, they need to feel very secure indeed before they'll risk their plumage getting completely soaked like this. Bedraggled plumage and the weight of water trapped amid the feathers represents a very substantial load for a tiny bird. It means that flight and agility in the air is temporarily impaired, and the bird therefore feels extremely vulnerable to predators. The beautiful firetail has a very close relative that occurs only in extreme southwestern Australia. This is the red-eared firetail, and the two species appear almost identical to the casual observer, differing in little more than a small patch of bright red on the face and white blotches rather than bars on the flanks. Its call is quite loud and strident, as grassfinch calls go, but none of the group has much by way of strong or varied songs. Within its extremely restricted range, it inhabits dense heath and riverside scrub in jarrah forests, mainly between Perth and Bunbury. In many respects, the red-eared firetail is the opposite of everything that is characteristic of the grassfinches as a group. It is, for example, essentially solitary rather than gregarious in behavior, and is more at home in the trees than on the ground. Many birds in difficult environments are generalists rather than specialists, and the red-eared firetail reveals this trend in the versatility of its foraging behavior. It feeds most often low in trees, gathering in grass stems as far as it can reach before changing perches. However, as here, it also feeds very often on the ground, either in the open or in dense cover, such as this vegetable patch. It sometimes visits flowering banksias and similar shrubs to nibble at the flowers, and has even been recorded sipping nectar like a honey eater. Australian grassfinches are essentially birds of the tropics, but one small group is better represented in the south than in the north. Members of this group have in common a bright red rump and are often referred to as firetails. One species, the painted firetail, inhabits arid spinifex grasslands in the interior, where it's especially common in rugged breakaway country. Painted firetails seldom move far from the vicinity of permanent water, which may explain their curiously patchy distribution. One hint of possibly other origins is that, like the Pictorella manakin, the birds drink by sipping rather than sucking. The seeds of spinifex constitute the staple diet, gathered almost exclusively on the ground, usually the bare earth between tussocks, but they also eat small insects. The bill is rather more pointed than is usual in grassfinches, an adaptation for probing for seeds and insects in tiny crevices and between small rocks and pebbles. Painted firetails build their roughly spherical nests on the ground or in spinifex clumps. On the ground, the birds sometimes build first a platform of small stones or fragments of wood before starting construction on the nest itself. At first, the male does most of the fetching, carrying and building, but the female joins in to help add the lining. The nest of the closely related diamond firetail is similar in that it too is constructed mainly of grass stems, but differs most obviously in being built usually in a bush or tree, at any height from 1 to 30 meters above the ground. Feathers are often used in the lining. However, one of the most striking aspects of grassfinch behavior happens before the nesting season begins.